Hello, and welcome to this day in history for December 16th. December 16th is the 350th day of the year in the Gregorian calendar, with 15 days remaining until the end of the year. And today's word is dogmatic. It's an adjective that means of or pertaining to or characteristic of a doctrine or code of beliefs accepted as authoritative, or relating to or involving dogma, or characterized by assertion of unproved or unprovable principles. To be dogmatic is to follow a set of rules no matter what. The rules might be religious, philosophical, or made up, but the dogmatic people are not likely to waver in their beliefs, and any exercise in trying to change their minds is likely to prove frustrating. This word comes to us from Latin dogma, which means tenet, or Greek dogma, which means opinion, and is ultimately from the Indo-European root dek, to take or accept, which also gives us dignity, discipline, doctor, decorate, docile, deign, condign, doxy, heterodox, and philodox. The earliest documented use of dogmatic is in the year 1605. And before we get started, I want to mention that links to my research are included in the show notes. So if you're wondering where I got this or that bit of information, you can find links to all my research right there in the show notes. And while I'm taking this moment to handle administrative matters, I'd like to remind you to like and subscribe. And with that, we're going to start with the year 1770, when composer Ludwig von Beethoven was born. A crucial figure in the transition between the classical and romantic eras in classical music, he remains one of the most recognized and influential musicians of this period and is considered to be one of the greatest composers of all time. He lived only to the age of 56. A remarkable body of work in that time. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party. In the Boston harbor, a group of Massachusetts colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 British tea ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The midnight raid, popularly known as the Boston Tea Party, was in protest of the British Parliament's Tea Act of 1773, a bill designed to save the faltering East India Company by lowering its tea tax and granting it a virtual monopoly on the American tea trade. The low tax allowed the East India Company to undercut even tea smuggled into America by Dutch traders, and many colonists viewed the act as another example of taxation tyranny. When 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor, the colonists demanded that the tea be returned to England. After Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused, Patriot leader Samuel Adams organized the Tea Party with about 60 members of the Sons of Liberty, his underground resistance group. The British tea dumped in Boston Harbor on the night of December 16 was valued at some $18,000. And I'm wondering if that was in current dollars and what that would translate to now. Parliament, outraged by the blatant destruction of British property, enacted the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts of 1774. The Coercive Acts closed Boston to merchant shipping, established formal British military rule in Massachusetts, made British officials immune to criminal prosecution in America, and required colonists to quarter British troops. That means they had to let them stay at their house. The colonists subsequently called the First Continental Congress to consider a united American resistance to the British. That's where it all started. In 1775, Jane Austen was born. Celebrated English novelist Jane Austen was born on December 16, 1775, the 7th of 8 children of a clergyman in a country village in Hampshire, England. Jane read voraciously and began writing stories as early as age 12, completing a novella at age 14. She concealed her writing from most of her acquaintances, slipping her paper under a blotter when someone would enter the room. Though she avoided society, she was charming, intelligent, and funny, and had several admirers. She actually accepted the marriage proposal of a well-off friend of her family's, but the next day withdrew her acceptance, having decided she could marry only for love. She published several more novels before her death, including Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Emma. She died at age 42 of what may have been Addison's disease. Nearly 200 years after her death, she's one of a handful of authors to have found enduring popularity with both academic and popular readers. In 1777, Virginia became the first state to ratify the Articles of Confederation. In 1811, the first two in a series of 4 severe earthquakes occurred near the vicinity of New Madrid, Missouri, and as Kent likes to remind me, that wasn't my fault. In 1893, Antonin Dvorak's New World Symphony received its world premiere in New York City. I've included a link in the show notes to a performance of this symphony, and I've cued that link to start at the Largo, which is one of my favorite parts. You can roll it back to the beginning if you want to hear it from the beginning. 1914, Germans bombarded English ports of Hartlepool and Scarborough. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, German battle cruisers from Franz von Hipper's scouting squadron caught the British Navy by surprise as they began heavy bombardment of Hartlepool and Scarborough, English port cities on the North Sea. The bombardment lasted for about 1.5 hours, killed more than 130 civilians and wounded another 500. This event would unleash a damning response from the British press, which pointed to the incident as yet another example of German brutality. The German Navy, however, saw the port cities as valid targets due to their fortified status. In 1917, British science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke was born. He was a British science fiction writer, science writer, and futurist, inventor, undersea explorer, and television series host. Probably most well known for his work 2001: A Space Odyssey. He lived to the age of 90. 1944, the Battle of the Bulge begins. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched the last major offensive of the war, Operation Mist, also known as the Ardennes Offensive in the Battle of the Bulge, an attempt to push the Allied front line west from northern France to northwestern Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge, so called because the Germans created a bulge around the area of the Ardennes forest in pushing through the American defensive line, was the largest fought on the Western Front. 1947, William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brattain built the first practical point-contact transistor. And I haven't done any additional research on that, but I noticed the date, 1947, and I remember that as a child in the early 60s, it was a big deal that we had transistor radios that we could play. It was a big deal. Transistor radios, yeah. Wouldn't be possible without that transistor. 1950, President Truman declared a state of emergency over the Korean War. In the wake of the massive Chinese intervention in the Korean War, President Harry S. Truman declared a state of emergency. Proclaiming that communist imperialism threatened the world's people, Truman called upon the American people to help construct an arsenal of freedom. In 1960, 2 airplanes collided over New York City. It killed 134 people on the planes and on the ground. The improbable mid-air collision is the only such accident to have occurred over a major city in U.S. history. May it ever be thus. In 1973, the Buffalo Bills running back Orenthal James O.J. Simpson became the first player in the National Football League to rush for more than 2,000 yards in a single season back when he was a football player. In 1980, American businessman Harlan David Sanders, better known as Colonel Sanders, founder of the fast food chicken restaurant chain Kentucky Fried Chicken, also known as KFC, passed away on this day at the age of 90. By the way, the title Colonel was honorary and not of military rank. 2009, the blockbuster science fiction film Avatar opened in U.S. theaters. One of the most expensive films ever made, it was also one of the most successful, holding the title of highest grossing film of all time for nearly a decade. Avatar was an immediate hit, supplanting the Titanic as the new highest grossing film of all time. Reviews were largely positive. It was nominated for 9 Academy Awards, including the Oscar for Best Art Direction, Best Cinematography, and Best Special Effects. Though many of its innovations are commonplace or even outdated now, Avatar is remembered for ushering in a new age of CGI-heavy blockbusters. And I think that's going to do it for us today. As always, links to my research are included in the show notes. Thank you so much for watching. Give it a like if you enjoyed this video. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. And feel free to share this video. While you're here, check out my other channel, 8 Susquehanna. I've included a link to that as well. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Alrighty. Back to work. Okie dokie, Smokey. Let's just rearrange that a little bit. Just read it like it's written. Sometimes when you read the words, it's not quite enough if you haven't put enough words in there to begin with. That's not the way I like to tell it anyway. We don't need all those words. Hope I pronounced that right. So happy for editing. So many edits. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? She's not a man. Did I do this whole thing without a microphone? Dadgummit. This is why I don't do live shows.